Part 1. The Sacred Secret of Aksumite Heights. The first rays of dawn barely penetrated the thick morning mist as our team began the treacherous ascent toward Abuna Garima Monastery. Perched precariously at 7,000 feet above sea level on Ethiopia's northern highlands, this ancient sanctuary has remained virtually untouched by the outside world for over 1,500 years. The narrow path, carved into sheer cliff faces, forced us to press our bodies against the cold stone, each step a calculated risk between solid ground and the yawning abyss below. "Few Westerners have ever laid eyes on what we're about to see," whispered Dr. Jacques Mercier, the renowned expert on Ethiopian manuscripts, his voice betraying both excitement and reverence. "Many have tried to reach this place, but the monks have protected their treasure from outsiders for centuries." What treasure could justify such a perilous journey? Hidden within the monastery's humble walls lies what may be humanity's oldest illustrated Christian Bible, a manuscript so ancient and so perfectly preserved that its very existence defies explanation. Carbon dating places its creation between 330 to 650 AD, making it nearly a millennium older than most Western Bibles and predating the famous Book of Kells by at least 2 centuries. The Garima Gospels, as they're known, remained completely unknown to the outside world until the 1950s. Even now, few scholars have been permitted to examine them. The monastery's isolation has kept this extraordinary relic hidden from wars, colonization, and the antiquities trade that has scattered so many ancient treasures across Western museums. As we reached the final stretch of our climb, the monastery's ancient wooden gates came into view. Behind those weathered doors waited not just an ancient book, but perhaps the most significant untold chapter in the history of Christianity, a direct window into the faith's earliest expressions. "What you're about to see," Dr. Mercier said, pausing to catch his breath, "will challenge everything Western scholars thought they knew about the development of early Christian texts and art. This isn't just old, it's revolutionary. How could such a priceless artifact exist for over 1,500 years, surviving invasions, fires, and time itself, while remaining virtually unknown to the world? What secrets might it contain that differ from the Bible most Christians know today? And most intriguingly, why has its existence been overlooked for so long by religious scholars and historians alike?" The answers lie within these ancient walls, preserved in vibrant pigments and ancient gaze script on pages that have outlasted empires. As the heavy wooden door creaked open, we prepared to enter a world where history, legend, and faith have been intertwined for nearly 2 millennia, and where the earliest visual expressions of Christianity have waited patiently to tell their story. Part 2. Divine Origins, Ethiopia's Ancient Christian Legacy. The story of Christianity in Ethiopia begins not with conquest or missionaries, but with a chance encounter on a desert road. In Acts 8:26-39, we find the account of an Ethiopian eunuch, a high official in Queen Candace's court, returning from Jerusalem after worshiping at the temple. This dignitary, reading from the book of Isaiah, meets Philip the evangelist, who explains the scripture and baptizes him. This seemingly minor biblical episode represents what many consider the genesis of one of the world's oldest continuous Christian traditions. "This wasn't just any conversion," explains Father Tuolda, the monastery's senior priest, his aged face illuminated by the dancing flames of ancient oil lamps. "The Ethiopian eunuch was a royal treasurer. When he returned to Aksum with his new faith, he brought Christianity directly into the royal court." But Ethiopian church tradition tells an even more compelling story. During the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great in the 4th century, 2 young Syrian brothers, Firminius and Odysseus, arrived in the Ethiopian capital of Aksum. Their eloquence and devotion so moved the royal family that the kingdom embraced Christianity as its official faith. After the conversion, Firminius traveled to Alexandria to meet with Bishop Athanasius, who consecrated him as Bishop of Ethiopia, establishing an ecclesiastical lineage that continues unbroken to this day. What's extraordinary, notes Dr. Elizabeth Phillips, historian of early Christianity, is that Ethiopia adopted Christianity as its state religion even before Rome did. This wasn't a colonial imposition. It was a sovereign choice that would define Ethiopian identity for the next 2 millennia. The 5th century brought a pivotal moment that would forever shape Ethiopia's religious landscape. In 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon declared the belief that Christ has two separate natures, divine and human, to be orthodox doctrine. Those who believed Christ had one nature, the Monophysites, were branded heretics and faced persecution throughout the Byzantine Empire. It was a theological dispute with profound consequences, Father Tewolde explains. Thousands fled Byzantium, seeking refuge in lands beyond imperial control. 9 especially learned monks made their way to Ethiopia, bringing with them their sacred texts, liturgical traditions, and artistic knowledge. These 9 saints, as Ethiopian tradition reveres them, transformed the religious landscape. They translated sacred texts into ge'ez, established monasteries in remote mountains, and preserved a distinctive form of Christianity that would have otherwise been lost to history. Among them was the legendary Abba Garima. Abba Garima's story transcends ordinary human capacity. Father Tewolde whispers, his voice filled with reverence. According to monastery tradition, Garima arrived from Constantinople in 494 AD and set about creating a gospel book. Determined to complete his sacred task, he began copying the text at dawn. As sunset approached, with his work unfinished, Garima prayed fervently, and God responded by holding the sun in place until he completed the final page. Is it merely a legend? Father Tewolde smiles. Perhaps, but consider this. The carbon dating places these Gospels precisely within Abba Garima's lifetime. Science and faith tell the same story. By the mid-6th century, Ethiopia's Christian identity was so firmly established that the Egyptian traveler Cosmas Indicopleustes documented it as a thoroughly Christian kingdom. The faith had taken roots so deeply that it would survive centuries of isolation when Muslim conquests severed Ethiopia's connections to other Christian lands. It was as if divine providence ensured that this expression of early Christianity would be preserved, Dr. Phillips reflects. While European Christianity evolved through councils, reformations, and counter-reformations, Ethiopia's faith remained a living time capsule of early Christian practice and belief. This theological isolation created the perfect conditions for preserving texts and traditions that would be altered or lost elsewhere. The Ethiopian Church maintained books excluded from other biblical canons and preserved artistic traditions that vanished from other Christian regions. The Ethiopian Bible that emerged from this unique history would become not just a religious text but the cornerstone of an entire cultural identity that would endure invasions, colonization attempts, and modernization. When you look at the Garima Gospels, Father Tewolde concludes, you're not just seeing an ancient book, you're witnessing the physical embodiment of a divine promise, that this faith would endure here until the end of time. Part 3. Sacred Anomalies. The Extraordinary Features of Ethiopia's Bible. Inside the dimly lit treasury room of Abuna Garima Monastery, Father Tewolde carefully removes layers of ancient silk coverings to reveal volumes that stand apart from any Bible most Christians would recognize. The Ethiopian Bible isn't merely an older version of the familiar text. It represents an entirely different branch of Christian scripture, preserved like a time capsule from Christianity's formative years. What makes this Bible truly extraordinary isn't just its age, explains Dr. Marilyn Heldman, expert on Ethiopian manuscripts. It's that it contains texts deemed heretical or apocryphal by other Christian traditions, but preserved here as divine scripture. The Ethiopian canon is essentially a window into an alternative history of Christianity. The Ethiopian Bible's canon is strikingly different in both content and scale. While most Protestant Bibles contain 66 books and Catholic Bibles 73, the narrower Ethiopian canon contains 81 books. The expanded Ethiopic canon includes even more, with 4 books of church practices, 2 books of the Testament, and Ethiopic versions of the Epistle of Clement and the Didascalia. Among the most significant additions are texts entirely absent from Western Bibles. The Book of Enoch, considered lost for centuries until rediscovered in Ethiopia, contains vivid apocalyptic visions and accounts of fallen angels. It's quoted directly in the New Testament's Book of Jude, yet was excluded from Western biblical canons around the 4th century. The Book of Enoch contains passages that profoundly shaped early Christian cosmology. Dr. Heldman notes while pointing to a striking illustration of angelic beings. Consider this passage. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them, and they taught them charms and enchantments. This account of fallen angels teaching humans forbidden knowledge influenced early Christian understanding of evil's origin, yet Western Christians have been unable to read it for nearly 1,500 years. Another remarkable inclusion is the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Lesser Genesis, which retells Genesis and Exodus with additional details about angelic revelations to Moses. Its calendar system, based on Jubilee periods of 49 years, differs significantly from later Jewish and Christian traditions. Jubilees contains a striking chronology of human history, Father Tewolde explains, carefully turning pages covered in the ancient Ge'ez script. It describes creation occurring in the first week of April, gives specific dates for every patriarch's birth and death, and establishes a calendar system that governed Ethiopian religious observances for centuries. The physical presentation of these texts is equally unprecedented. The two manuscripts, Garima I and Garima II, differ significantly in style while sharing the same approximate age. Garima I comprises 348 preserved pages, beginning with 11 illustrated canonical tables housed in ornate arcades, followed by gospel texts in Ge'ez. Its original wooden cover, wrapped in gilded copper, is the world's oldest book cover still attached to its original manuscript, predating even the 7th century Gospel of St. Cuthbert. Garima II, comprising 322 pages, features 17 illustrated pages, including 4 remarkable portraits of evangelists preceding their respective Gospels. The portrait of Mark is particularly revolutionary, depicting him in profile on the episcopal throne of Alexandria, a perspective rarely seen in Byzantine art of the period. These illustrations shatter our understanding of early Christian art, explains Dr. Jacques Mercier. Look at this portrait of Mark. The three-quarter profile, the anatomical detail in the hands, the architectural background. These artistic elements weren't supposed to exist until centuries later. Another illustrated page depicts what appears to be Solomon's temple, with an unusual staircase design found nowhere else in Christian iconography. This unique visual language challenges the assumption that early Christian art evolved uniformly throughout the Mediterranean world. The manuscript's material composition tells its own story of innovation. The parchment is made from goatskin, rather than the sheepskin typically used in European manuscripts, prepared using local techniques that have proven remarkably durable. The vivid pigments, brilliant reds extracted from indigenous plants, blues from crushed local stones, and golds applied with techniques unique to the region, have retained their vibrancy for over 1,500 years. Perhaps most extraordinary is the language itself. The ancient Ge'ez script, which appears as elegant angular characters to untrained eyes, represents one of the world's oldest continuously used alphabetic scripts. Though no longer spoken, Ge'ez remains the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, much like Latin in Catholic tradition before the 1960s. Ge'ez isn't merely a vehicle for the text. It's integral to its preservation, explains linguistic scholar Dr. Faisal Gidey. The language's isolation protected these texts from theological corrections that altered biblical manuscripts elsewhere. When scribes in Europe were standardizing their texts according to evolving doctrine, Ethiopian scribes were faithfully reproducing the ancient words exactly as they had received them. The scribal traditions that produced these manuscripts reflect a spiritual discipline almost unimaginable today. Monks prepared for copying scripture through fasting and prayer, viewing their work not merely as reproduction, but as sacred meditation. Each character was formed with deliberate intention, each page a spiritual exercise rather than mere documentation. Before writing a single letter, a scribe would pray, "Let my fingers become like the pens of swift writers." Father Tewolde demonstrates, holding his hands as if grasping an ancient reed pen. The physical creation of Scripture was itself a form of worship. The Ethiopian Bible differs not only in content and appearance, but in theological emphasis. While it contains the familiar gospel narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, it places greater emphasis on his divinity than his humanity, a reflection of the Monophysite theology that found refuge in Ethiopia after being rejected at the Council of Chalcedon. In these pages, Jesus appears more transcendent, more explicitly divine than in later Western depictions, notes theological historian Dr. Samuel Johannes. This isn't a later theological development, it's a preservation of how some of the earliest Christians understood Christ. Even in its New Testament, subtle but significant variations exist. The Ethiopian version of Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, for instance, includes additional names absent from Greek manuscripts, suggesting access to source materials now lost to other traditions. What we have here isn't just an ancient Bible, Dr. Heldman concludes, gazing at the open pages of Garima II. It's an alternative history of Christianity, one that flourished in isolation while Western Christianity developed along a different path. These aren't just variations or curiosities. They represent an entire branch of Christian tradition that could have become dominant had history unfolded differently. As Father Tewolde carefully rewraps the precious volumes in their protective coverings, one cannot help but wonder. If these books contain authentic early Christian traditions, preserved while being lost elsewhere, what might they reveal about Christianity's foundational beliefs that later traditions have forgotten or deliberately removed? Part 4. Survival Against All Odds, Discovery and Preservation. The mere existence of the Garima Gospels defies historical probability. By all reasonable measures, these ancient manuscripts should have been destroyed centuries ago, victims of time, conflict, or natural disaster. Their survival represents what some scholars call the greatest miracle in the history of biblical preservation. Consider what these manuscripts have endured, explains Dr. Blair Priday of the Ethiopian Heritage Fund, gesturing toward the monastery's simple stone walls. The Muslim conquests that isolated Ethiopia from other Christian lands in the 7th century, the devastating raids by Ahmed Grein in the 16th century that destroyed countless Ethiopian churches and manuscripts, the Italian occupation of the 1930s, a fire that consumed the monastery church itself. Yet somehow, these irreplaceable treasures survived. According to monastery records, when Ahmed Grein's forces approached in 1531, the monks fled into the surrounding mountains, carrying their most precious manuscripts with them. They hid in caves for nearly 3 years, moving constantly to avoid detection, all while protecting the ancient Gospels. They didn't just hide the books, they continued to use them for daily worship, even while in hiding, Father Tewolde explains. The monks believed that stopping the liturgical reading, even during war, would break a sacred covenant stretching back to Abba Garima himself. During the Italian occupation 4 centuries later, the monks employed an even more audacious strategy. They created convincing decoy manuscripts, deliberately aged to appear ancient, which they surrendered to Italian authorities while concealing the genuine Gospels beneath the monastery's stone floor. The monks understood their role as guardians, not owners, notes historian Dr. Getachew Heil. Each generation saw itself as a temporary custodian of something that transcended them, something that had to be preserved for future generations at any cost. The Garima Gospels remained largely unknown to the outside world until a chance discovery in the 1950s. British art historian Beatrice Plain, traveling through Ethiopia's northern highlands, heard rumors of an ancient manuscript preserved at a remote monastery. After a difficult journey, Plain became one of the first Westerners to view the Gospels, though the monks permitted her only to observe, not to touch or photograph the sacred texts. Plain's description was met with skepticism in academic circles, recalls manuscript expert Dr. Judith Mackenzie. Many scholars believed that no manuscript from the 6th century could possibly have survived in sub-Saharan Africa. The academic world essentially dismissed her account as exaggeration or misidentification. This skepticism persisted until 1968, when art historian Jules Leroy visited the monastery and was permitted to take limited photographs. Even then, few scholars took serious interest in what would later prove to be one of Christianity's most important early manuscripts. There was a kind of academic colonialism at work, Dr. Mackenzie explains. Western scholars simply couldn't accept that an African monastery might house biblical manuscripts older and more significant than those in European collections. The true turning point came in the early 2000s when the Ethiopian Heritage Fund initiated a conservation project for the deteriorating manuscripts. For the first time, secular conservation experts were granted access to the Gospels, allowing for limited carbon dating and scientific analysis under the watchful eyes of the monastery's guardians. What we discovered astonished everyone, recalls conservator Lester Capon. The carbon dating placed the manuscripts between 330 and 650 AD, making them not just old, but potentially the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts in the world. This scientific confirmation triggered a race against time. The manuscripts, having survived for over 1,500 years, now faced a new threat: deterioration. Centuries of handling during religious ceremonies had weakened the parchment structure. The binding was failing, pigments were flaking, and some pages had become so fragile that they crumbled at the slightest touch. We faced an impossible dilemma, explains Dr. Priday. These manuscripts needed immediate conservation work, but traditional conservation techniques would require removing them from the monastery, something the monks categorically refused to permit. This standoff between scientific preservation and religious tradition sparked intense debate. Western conservators argued that without modern intervention, the manuscripts might not survive another century. The monks countered that removing the Gospels from their sacred setting, even temporarily, would break a spiritual protection that had preserved them for 15 centuries. We had to completely rethink our approach to conservation, Capon recalls. Instead of bringing the manuscripts to a lab, we had to bring the lab to the manuscripts. A groundbreaking on-site conservation studio was established within the monastery itself, the first of its kind in Ethiopia. Monks were trained in basic conservation techniques, allowing them to participate in preserving their sacred heritage while ensuring all work adhered to their spiritual requirements. During this conservation process came perhaps the most startling discovery yet. Using non-invasive multispectral imaging, a technique that reveals ink invisible to the naked eye, researchers detected evidence of an earlier text beneath portions of the Garima Gospels. We found a palimpsest, a manuscript written over an earlier erased text, explains Dr. Michael Gervers, who led the imaging team. Fragments of the underlying text appear to be in a form of early Greek or possibly an even older form of gaze. This suggests the parchment may have been reused with an earlier text erased to make way for the Gospels. This discovery raises provocative questions. What was this earlier text? Why was it erased? Could it contain Christian writings even older than the Gospels themselves, perhaps dating to the very introduction of Christianity to Ethiopia? The underlying text remains largely unreadable with current technology, Dr. Gervers acknowledges. But advances in imaging technology may soon allow us to recover this hidden layer of history without physically disturbing the manuscripts. The conservation project faces ongoing challenges. The monastery's remote location, accessible only by a difficult mountain trek, complicates the transportation of conservation materials. The lack of electricity and climate control creates conservation obstacles unknown in modern Western facilities. And the manuscript's continued use in religious ceremonies creates inevitable tension between preservation and living tradition. These aren't museum pieces. They're active participants in a living faith, Father Tewolde emphasizes. To remove them from worship would be to kill their spirit while preserving their body. This tension between preservation and use represents a fundamental philosophical difference in how cultures view their heritage. Western conservation philosophy typically prioritizes physical preservation above all else. The Ethiopian tradition sees the spiritual purpose of sacred objects as paramount. The physical object finds its meaning through continued ritual use, even if that use eventually leads to its physical deterioration. We're in a race against time, Dr. Priday acknowledges. Even with the best conservation efforts, these manuscripts remain vulnerable. Climate change brings new threats, increasing humidity, more extreme temperature fluctuations, and even the risk of flooding in previously arid regions. The digitization of the manuscripts, creating high-resolution images of every page, provides some security against their potential loss. Yet even the most perfect digital copy cannot capture the manuscript's full material reality. The texture of the parchment, the three-dimensional quality of the pigments, the subtle marks of the scribe's hands. What we're preserving isn't just information, explains Dr. Mackenzie. It's a physical connection to the earliest days of Christianity, an unbroken chain linking 21st century believers to their spiritual ancestors 15 centuries ago. As conservation work continues, the monks maintain their centuries-old vigilance, guarding these treasures as their predecessors have done through wars, fires, and the relentless passage of time. For them, the survival of the Garima Gospels is not merely fortunate. It is providential, evidence of divine protection that will continue regardless of human intervention. These books have outlived everyone who has ever touched them, Father Tewolde observes with quiet certainty. They will outlive us as well. Part 5. Beyond Ancient Pages, the Enduring Significance. Beyond their remarkable age and survival story, the Garima Gospels possess a significance that transcends their material existence. These manuscripts represent far more than historical curiosities. They challenge fundamental assumptions about Christianity's development, raise profound questions about canonicity, and offer insights into how sacred texts shape cultural identity. What these manuscripts reveal, explains Dr. Elizabeth Phillips, is that Christianity was never the monolithic entity we sometimes imagine. From its earliest days, diverse expressions of Christian faith developed simultaneously across Africa, Asia, and Europe, each with its own theological emphases and cultural forms. This diversity challenges the traditional narrative that places European Christianity at the center of Christian history. The Ethiopian Bible's unique canon, with its inclusion of texts like Enoch and Jubilees, reveals that what we now consider apocryphal or pseudepigraphical were once considered authentic scripture by some of Christianity's oldest communities. Consider the implications, urges biblical scholar Dr. Samuel Johannes. If the Ethiopian Church, one of Christianity's oldest continuous traditions, preserved texts that Western churches excluded, shouldn't we at least question whether those exclusions were based on theological insight or political expediency? The Book of Enoch provides a compelling case study. Quoted directly in the New Testament's Book of Jude and referenced by early Christian writers, it was widely read in early Christian communities. Yet by the 4th century, as Christianity became Rome's official religion, Enoch was gradually excluded from Western canons. Enoch's cosmology, with its detailed angelology and apocalyptic visions, didn't align with the more philosophical theology developing in Roman Christianity, Dr. Johannes explains. But in Ethiopia, where Christianity developed without imperial constraints, these older traditions were preserved intact. This preservation raises profound questions. What might modern Christianity look like if texts like Enoch had remained canonical? How might Western theology differ if it had maintained the cosmological worldview of these early texts, rather than absorbing Greek philosophical influences? Beyond theological implications, the Garima Gospels possess extraordinary artistic significance. Their illuminations, created when most of Europe was in the Dark Ages, represent the earliest surviving examples of Christian manuscript illustration. These aren't crude or primitive drawings, art historian Dr. Marilyn Heldman emphasizes. They display sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities, complex symbolic systems, and technical skills we didn't think existed in the 6th century. They force us to rewrite the history of Christian art. The portraits of evangelists in Garima II are particularly revolutionary. The image of Mark, depicted in three-quarter profile rather than the frontal style typical of Byzantine art, suggests artistic innovations we previously attributed to much later periods. Looking at these portraits is like finding Renaissance perspective techniques in an ancient Egyptian tomb, Dr. Heldman explains. It simply shouldn't exist at this date, but it does, forcing us to reconsider the entire developmental timeline of Western art. For Ethiopia itself, these manuscripts represent the cornerstone of national identity. In a country that has faced repeated invasions, colonization attempts, and internal conflicts, the continuous tradition preserved in these texts has provided cultural coherence across centuries. During the Italian occupation of the 1930s, these manuscripts weren't just religious objects, they were symbols of Ethiopian sovereignty, explains cultural historian Dr. Getachew Haile. When Mussolini's forces destroyed Ethiopian libraries and monuments, preserving these texts became an act of national resistance. This cultural significance creates inevitable tensions around ownership and access. While Western institutions have proposed relocating the manuscripts to climate-controlled facilities for better preservation, these suggestions often ignore their living religious and cultural context. The question isn't simply where these manuscripts would be safest physically, argues Ethiopian heritage advocate Afewerk Tekle. It's where they remain meaningful. Removed from their ritual context and community, they would become mere museum pieces, technically preserved but spiritually dead. This tension reflects a broader philosophical divide in how different cultures value heritage. The Western museum tradition often emphasizes physical preservation and academic accessibility, while Ethiopian tradition prioritizes spiritual continuity and community access. What's the true value of an ancient manuscript? Questions Father Tewolde. Is it measured in dollars at auction, in the information it contains, or in its power to connect a community to its ancestors and to God? These different values cannot be easily reconciled. Indeed, if assessed purely by market standards, the Grima Gospels would be virtually priceless. When rare biblical manuscripts appear at auction, they command millions. An Ethiopian psalter from the 16th century recently sold for over $850,000. The Grima Gospels, nearly a millennium older and far more significant, would likely become the most valuable manuscripts ever sold. But such valuations miss the point entirely, insists Dr. Blair Prede. Their true worth lies not in what collectors would pay, but in what they mean to Ethiopian Christians and to our understanding of Christianity's earliest expressions. For scholars of liturgy and religious practice, the manuscripts offer equally valuable insights. The Ethiopian Church's rituals, developed in isolation for centuries, preserve elements of worship that disappeared elsewhere after the 7th century. When Ethiopian priests celebrate liturgy today, they're performing rituals with direct links to how Christians worshipped in the 6th century, explains liturgical scholar Dr. Habtamiko Kidain. These aren't reconstructions or reenactments. They're living continuations of ancient practice. The manuscripts also challenge scholarly assumptions about the transmission of religious knowledge in pre-modern Africa. The sophisticated theological understanding displayed in these texts contradicts colonial-era assumptions about African Christianity being simplistic or derivative. These manuscripts aren't mere copies of texts received from elsewhere, Dr. Kidain emphasizes. They show active theological engagement, sophisticated visual interpretation, and cultural adaptation that demonstrates the intellectual vitality of Ethiopian Christianity from its earliest days. Perhaps most profoundly, the Grima Gospels raise questions about historical contingency in religious development. They invite us to consider how Christianity might have evolved differently if historical circumstances, the rise of Islam, the fall of Byzantium, the European colonial expansion, had unfolded differently. What we see in these manuscripts is not just an alternative past, reflects Dr. Phillips, but a glimpse of alternative possibilities for Christianity's development, paths not taken, voices not heard, perspectives marginalized by the accidents of history and power. For Ethiopian Christians themselves, however, these scholarly considerations remain secondary to the manuscript's living spiritual significance. When used in liturgy, these ancient pages continue to fulfill their original purpose, connecting believers to divine revelation across the centuries. When I touch these pages, Father Tewolde says softly, I feel the presence of Abba Garima himself, and beyond him, the disciples, and beyond them, Christ. This is not history to us, it is presence. As Ethiopia navigates complex processes of modernization and globalization, these ancient texts serve as anchors of cultural continuity and national pride. In a world of rapid change and cultural homogenization, they stand as testament to Ethiopia's unique religious heritage and its centuries-long tradition of preserving knowledge through times of adversity. These aren't just Ethiopia's treasures, concludes Dr. Pride. They belong to all humanity as witnesses to our shared cultural heritage. But they remind us that preservation without respect for living tradition and cultural context ultimately fails to preserve what matters most. Part 6. Veiled Origins, unanswered questions, and future discoveries. As the sun sets behind the rugged Ethiopian highlands, casting long shadows across the monastery courtyard, our journey of discovery reaches not an end, but a threshold. The Garima Gospels have revealed many secrets, yet they guard others with the same tenacity that has preserved them for 15 centuries. What we know about these manuscripts is dwarfed by what remains unknown, admits Dr. Jacques Mercier, gathering his notes as our time at the monastery draws to a close. Each answer has spawned a dozen new questions. Perhaps the most tantalizing mystery emerged only recently through advanced imaging technology. Beneath certain pages of Garima II, traces of an earlier text have been detected, a palimpsest partially erased to make way for the gospel text. While most of this underlying script remains illegible with current technology, fragments deciphered thus far hint at something extraordinary. The underlying text appears to contain elements of Egyptian Coptic, combined with symbols resembling those from South Arabian scripts, reveals epigraphic specialist Dr. Aaron Butts. This suggests a previously unknown hybrid writing system that may predate the established timeline for Gaia's literature. If confirmed, this discovery would revolutionize our understanding of Ethiopia's pre-Christian literary traditions. More provocatively, some scholars have identified possible similarities between these fragments and certain Dead Sea Scroll texts, raising the tantalizing possibility of direct connections between Ethiopian scribal traditions and ancient Jewish communities. We may be looking at evidence of a much earlier Judaic presence in Ethiopia than previously documented. Dr. Butts suggests cautiously. This would lend historical credibility to Ethiopia's traditional claims of ancient connections to Jerusalem and the Solomonic dynasty. This potential connection to ancient Judaism aligns with Ethiopia's national epic, the Kebra Nagast, which claims that Ethiopia's rulers descended from the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. While Western scholars have often dismissed this as legendary, the palimpsest raises new possibilities about ancient religious exchanges between Jerusalem and Aksum. Other mysteries surround the manuscript's creation. While tradition attributes them to Abba Garima himself, the distinct styles of Garima I and Garima II suggest multiple artists working in different traditions. The illuminations in Garima I show clear Byzantine influences, notes Dr. Marilyn Heldman, while Garima II incorporates elements reminiscent of Syriac and Coptic traditions, yet with distinctive features found nowhere else. This suggests a cosmopolitan community of artists from throughout the Christian world collaborating in early Ethiopia. This artistic diversity challenges historical narratives that portrayed early African Christianity as merely derivative of European forms. Instead, it suggests Ethiopia as a center where diverse Christian traditions converged and cross-fertilized, creating new artistic expressions that would later influence traditions elsewhere. Technical analyses of the pigments have revealed another surprise. Some colors were created using mineral compounds previously thought unavailable in 6th century Ethiopia, including a distinctive blue derived from a processing method not documented elsewhere until the 12th century. Either these techniques were developed independently in Ethiopia centuries before their appearance elsewhere, explains conservation scientist Dr. Sarah Fiddyment, or there were trade and knowledge networks extending between Ethiopia and distant regions that haven't been documented in historical records. Beyond material questions lie deeper theological mysteries. Why does the Ethiopian canon include texts excluded elsewhere? Was this preservation intentional or accidental, the result of isolation rather than choice? And how might these preserved texts change our understanding of early Christianity? The Ethiopian Bible preserves layers of early Christian thought that were systematically removed from Western traditions, suggests theological historian Dr. Samuel Johannes. Reading these texts doesn't just add information, it fundamentally alters how we understand Christianity's foundational centuries. As new technologies develop, more secrets may emerge. Advanced non-destructive testing methods, currently in development, could soon analyze the manuscript's materials at the molecular level without physical sampling. Enhanced imaging techniques may reveal completely hidden texts or images beneath visible surfaces. We're on the cusp of a technological revolution in manuscript studies, Dr. Fiddyman explains. What remains illegible today may be clearly visible within a decade, allowing us to read these ancient pages layer by layer, like archaeological strata. For Father Tuolde and the monastery's monks, however, these scientific investigations remain secondary to the manuscript's ongoing spiritual purpose. As he gently returns the Gospels to their protective coverings, he offers a perspective that transcends academic inquiry. You scholars seek what is hidden in these pages, he says with a gentle smile, but we seek who is revealed through them. Both pursuits have their place. This perspective reminds us that despite all scientific analysis, these manuscripts remain living sacred objects, not merely historical artifacts. Their primary purpose, connecting believers to divine revelation, continues uninterrupted after 15 centuries. As our team prepares to depart the monastery, descending the same treacherous path that brought us here, we carry not just data and images, but a profound appreciation for the cultural resilience that has preserved these treasures. In an age of ephemeral digital information, there is something humbling about touching pages that have endured since the fall of the Roman Empire. How much of our current knowledge will survive 15 centuries? Dr. Mercier wonders aloud as we begin our descent. These manuscripts remind us of both the fragility and durability of human knowledge. How much can be lost, yet how much can endure when communities commit to preservation. The story of the Garima Gospels is far from complete. Each new study reveals additional layers of significance, challenging established narratives and opening new avenues for research. What other treasures might remain undiscovered in Ethiopia's remote monasteries and churches? What other chapters of Christianity's diverse early history await rediscovery? For those who wish to explore these questions further, opportunities are emerging. The Ethiopian Heritage Fund continues its conservation work throughout Ethiopia, training local conservators and documenting previously unstudied manuscripts. Digital humanities projects are making Ethiopian manuscripts accessible to scholars worldwide. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church itself is increasingly engaging with international scholarship while maintaining its traditional practices. The Ethiopian Bible stands as a powerful reminder that history is not a single narrative, but a complex tapestry of traditions, some preserved, others lost, all shaped by the contingencies of power, geography, and human choice. In these ancient pages, we glimpse not just the past as it was, but paths not taken. Alternative visions of Christianity that developed beyond the reach of imperial power and ecclesiastical standardization. As the monastery fades from view behind us, its secrets return to the guardianship that has preserved them for centuries. Yet something of their power remains with us, a humbling reminder of how much remains to be discovered about humanity's spiritual and cultural heritage, hidden in plain sight in the remote corners of our world. Follow the Consciousness channel for more such little-known but vitally important knowledge. Support our ongoing exploration by subscribing and sharing this video with others who appreciate the depth and diversity of human spiritual heritage. 38:15 Conclusion. If you found this exploration of the Ethiopian Bible enlightening, we invite you to join the conversation. What aspects of this ancient manuscript fascinated you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This journey into forgotten chapters of religious history is just beginning. Subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about upcoming videos exploring other hidden treasures of human spiritual heritage. If you believe others would appreciate this knowledge, please share this video with friends and family who value historical and spiritual discoveries. Your support helps us continue uncovering these remarkable stories. If you enjoyed this exploration, please take a moment to like this video and help us reach more curious minds. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time and faith.